This is Jan Henderson, the Senior Capacity Development Specialist with INGENAES, working through the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and my colleague.
This is Dr. Kathy Culverson, Associate Director for IFAS Global at the University of Florida and Associate Director for the INGENAES project based in Gainesville, Florida.
And today we'd like to share with you about an introductory workshop on integrating gender and nutrition within agricultural extension services.
And I'd like to talk a little bit about how this workshop came to be and the materials that were developed to share with extensionists throughout the INGENAES project as well as throughout the world. Essentially, some of the ideas around this project and around the materials in the workshop came from a previous USAID project called Modernizing Extension and Agricultural Services. I was invited to develop some materials about specifically integrating gender into extension because they did not exist from that perspective, and those are available on the MIA's website, and I'm sure Andrea will provide that. But these materials were developed and then tested in a variety of different countries in East Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America. And the materials from this were then used as sort of the genesis for developing materials for INGENAES, which was not only about integrating gender, but also about integrating nutrition, because for extension people that work in the field, those kinds of materials don't really exist on a practical participatory level. And so Jan and I developed these materials and now have been testing them in numerous workshops around the world through different INGENAES countries. There has been a lot of interest by USAID as well as other funding agencies in how to integrate gender and nutrition, and specifically doing it at a level that is a field-based level where people can use this readily and then actually adapt it to their own contextual needs. So we've been very excited about developing these materials. They are available on INGENAES' website, and we'd like to talk just a little bit about how we have used these materials in different countries and what the exercises actually look like. Okay, so Jan and I got together, I think it was about a year or so ago, and we began to brainstorm around what are some of these issues that we need to think about when we're looking at integrating gender and nutrition. And so we did a lot of research on materials that currently exist, and then we started to begin to think about from a very practical perspective, because both of us have done a lot of field work with not only extensionists but field-based staff, to how can we adapt these in ways that are most useful for folks that are working on a day-to-day basis, particularly with small farm families. And so I think Jan's going to talk a little bit about how the content of these materials were developed and how we really, I'd say, kind of adapted materials that we had previously, looked at what was currently in existence, and then actually provided a real innovative way of doing this. So Jan, if you want to talk about how we developed this, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. I came down to the University of Florida in April of 2015 and to work on the materials. I reviewed many online and actual hard copies of different materials. For example, we adapted some materials from Helen Keller International Bangladesh that were very helpful. And we developed a facilitator's guide. It was 38 pages, and we've adapted that. The most recent version is April 2016. So that's available. And then to accompany the facilitator's guide, Kathy and I developed 1 to 2 page activity sheets that followed the 7 activities that go through our 3-day workshop. And those have been developed and translated into not only English, but into Russian, Bengali, and Nepalese. And as Kathy mentioned, these are available on the INGENAES website for people to use. They're constantly being, after each workshop that we've done, we've revised them, modified them based on the feedback and the experiences that we have. We'd like to share with you the the 7 activities that we go through in the 3-day workshop and talk a little bit about what were the objectives and our experiences for those. So our first activity that we do during the 3-day workshop is who does what. And we ask the participants to begin to identify who in a typical rural family does what activities in the home, on the farm, and in the community. And we're asking the participants to list all the different activities that they can think of that occur in those locations. And they're doing that in their small groups, and then we ask them to really begin thinking about in terms of what do the women do usually are performed by women, which are performed or done by men, and which are done by both. And Kathy, maybe a few comments on some of our experiences with that.
For sure. This is a really fun and engaging way to get people to understand the basics of a gender analysis about who does what in the household. And we look at it from a couple different perspectives, not only the home, which in general in most places in the world is predominated by women, but then we talk a little bit about who does what in the home and how could we begin to make some of those activities a little bit more equitable. But then we also do it from a farm perspective because, again, what we notice, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about the exercise and agricultural value chains, is that women are often predominantly located in the production ends, the more basic ends, but then they lose both their involvement as well as their control of activities as we move out of the household. And so this really helps to demonstrate in both a graphic and kind of a visual way for participants about where do we see issues related to equity as it pertains to just a basic gender analysis. So this is kind of one of our introductory exercises, and it kind of breaks the ice, and people have fun drawing.
Mm-hmm. Good. Our second activity that we focus on is who has power and control. And there we look at explore factors that give people power within a household. We look at power dynamics and how those power dynamics can shift. And then we talk a little bit about suggestions on how the participants themselves can influence and talk about power when they're with the men and women farmers that they work with. So Kathy, do you want to explain how we do that activity actually?
Sure, exactly. And this, again, every one of the exercises that we do is potentially dealing with a sensitive topic, and particularly when we're working in more traditional cultures. And so we always try to find ways that are sort of fun and innovative and creative and participatory, but at the same time address really significant and sometimes potentially painful issues. And this is one of those issues that is becoming more and more important to discuss, is about who has power in different situations and who has control in different situations, because again it helps to kind of bring those topics to a forefront by looking at in a typical family, who might be at the head of the hierarchy, and usually it's going to be some male member of the family, and who might be at the lowest end of the hierarchy, and usually it's going to be some female member of the family. And then to really begin to talk about, as it relates to who does what are the issues around power, what are the issues around control of resources, what are the issues around equity, and then how does that pertain to not only your individual culture, but potentially even your own home. And so we try to personalize these exercises when we think it's appropriate. And again, it generates a lot of discussion and really getting people to think about, if I am the male in the family, what given levels of power and control do I have that I'm exercising either known to me or unknown to me, and what kinds of power and control does my wife or the female members of my family have, either known to me or unknown to me. So it kind of helps to make some of this unknown embedded cultural norms brought to the surface and discussed, which is really, really quite powerful. It's also the beginnings of a discussion around what we call gender transformative approaches, which is really not only just looking at who does what, but really about issues related to power in the household and in the culture. So this is kind of our introductory session to really looking at gender transformations.
I think, Kathy, too, one of the interesting things we have done with this activity, after they have put the different family members up on our sticky wall and moved them around, is ask them, what gives them power?
Yeah.
And we have identified that it usually is related to land, who has the land, educational level, tradition, and we talk about what happens when the person at the top of the power hierarchy either moves or passes away, and how does the power shift within the family. So we get into some interesting discussions.
Exactly, and that just reminds me, Jan, because I'm thinking about, this is one of the fantastic things about this workshop and the materials, is that we're very, very contextually focused within the framework of the actual workshop exercises. So if there's an opportunity that pops up, and this was one of these exercises where that happened, where we thought about, power and control within the culture and within their individual families, and not only what are those criteria that give someone more power over another person, but what aspects can they potentially influence within both their household and within their culture, and what might they then at the end of the workshop be willing to commit to change as far as behaviors and habits, not only within their household, but then also potentially within their immediate community and or their culture. And some of those, I would almost call those true confessions at the end of the workshop, are really very, very powerful. So it's been an amazing exercise.
Yes. Our next activity, exploring gender stereotypes or gender myths, always is an interesting activity that we have. There were looking at perceptions that the participants have about how men and women are supposed to behave in their particular culture. So we're asking the women to dress up as men, and the men to portray and dress up as women. And we have certainly had some interesting occurrences there. So Kathy, do you want to share what we have?
Yeah, this one is one of my favorite exercises, because we really encourage and egg on the participants to very much get into their roles. Not only to dress up looking like a male or a female, which for most of these males is, of course, the first time they've ever done it. And some workshops and cultures are more willing to do it than others. And Jan, you might want to talk about that. But it's also really interesting what comes up in these exercises, because we ask them to kind of typify a traditional or typical household and who does what, and to see, if the man is portraying the woman, he knows that she gets up before everyone else and does all this work before the family even wakes up in the morning, and he knows that she is working nonstop, and that he knows she is often subject to gender-based violence. And so we see these kinds of interactions happening within these skits and these role plays. And then when we debrief it afterwards and we talk about, so what did you see? How did you feel? What was it like for you as a man to portray a woman and you as a woman to portray a man? And we talk about, not only the actual experience within these households or communities, but the feelings and the emotions associated with it, so that we can really, tie into how does that affect your behaviors? Because our goal throughout this entire workshop is not only to increase awareness about these issues, but to really get folks thinking and committing to how they might change their own individual behaviors and their own effects within their households and their communities. And this is a very powerful exercise, because I remember the one guy, I think it was in Nepal, that said to us, I never realized how hard my wife worked, and I am really going to make an effort when I go home to try and help her more. And that was a very powerful statement coming from a totally traditional male, and I just think we're seeing more and more of that when we finish these workshops, particularly from the male perspective.
Yeah, we asked when we're debriefing this activity, we ask, how did it feel to play the part of a woman or a man? And I remember the young woman in Bangladesh. She just said, this is the first time I felt like I really had power. And this one is even though it's a fun way to do the exercise, it brings up just some really some emotions from not only themselves but also the people they work with.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that leads us right into this next exercise, which is equally powerful. Jan, yes. You want to just talk a little bit about this one?
Yeah, the power over versus power with. And there we're trying to yes, it segues nicely because we talk about, illustrate two types of power. And first we have asked the participants what words do they associate with power over. And we have them list that. And going back to the role plays that they just saw, where did they see examples of some what we would call negative behaviors, power over, and then we ask them, where did you see some positive behaviors within the role plays, which would be power with. So we're asking, looking at ways to move from power over to power with.
Exactly. And I would say one of the recurring themes that I think we've seen in almost every single workshop, and particularly in this exercise, is around the issue of gender-based violence. And yes. I have just been, yes. I have to say, sadly shocked yes. by how frequent this is in all the countries that we're working in. And we talk about that a little bit. I mean, obviously we're not experts on this, and one of our goals is to really talk about the potential for implications of doing this workshop and doing this work within traditional cultures, particularly if you might disrupt the power balance. And so we're always reiterating to people that we're working with to be very, very aware of and very clued into what's going on within that community, to understand the power dynamics, so that at the very least that these workshops do no harm, and particularly to the women that might be involved in attending these things. So this particular exercise, we debrief this and talk about that. And again, if you are knowledgeable of gender-based violence that's happening in the groups or the communities that you work with, what do you do about that? Who do you contact? What organizations exist as references to be able to assist you in addressing that? Because this is a topic, as I say, that continuously recurs.
So what we're also doing here is asking in their small groups, the role play group, to come up with create a symbol that would portray, capture the power over and power with, that they could use as a teaching tool or a training tool when they're out in the field. So that's what you're seeing here, some examples that they have, the different participants have come up with, how they symbolize and talk about power over and power with. And again, it's been very interesting culturally to see how they depict that.
Exactly.
Our next activity, we move away from the gender part and start moving a little bit to the nutrition part. So our next activity is who gets what to eat, or who eats what. And there were, our objective is to look at how are different members in a family, how is food distributed to the different family members. And we have a typical family that we are preparing a meal for, and then talk about how is that food distributed to the different family members. So Kathy,
exactly. And I would say, again, this sort of emphasizes, Jan, that what we attempt to do in each one of these exercises, not only to talk about from a content perspective about, nutrition, et cetera, but to do a visual representation so that people walk away with that stark image in their mind of, oh my goodness, if we again look back at the power structure in the household and we see who not only has power, but who eats what. And then we talk about nutrition from the perspective that it's usually pregnant, lactating, and young mothers and young children from in utero to the first 1,000 days that have the highest nutritional needs. And then we look at the reality in the household that the woman and the female children are usually the ones that receive the least amount of protein and nutrition. Then we really start to talk about what is it going to take to shift that kind of power dynamic in the household so that the people who have the greatest need for nutrition are moved up the food chain, literally, and receive those kinds of benefits. And so this is, again, it's an interactive exercise that not only talks about nutrition, but it also looks at it from the perspective of bringing in all the information related to the gender analysis that we've talked previously.
And I think, Kathy, too, when we've done this exercise, we're always having them think of how this plays out in a typical rural family. Right. But this is one exercise where many times when they're debriefing, we're talking about the exercise, they start bringing up their own experiences, their own family, yep, and how they see that the sons and the male members actually in their own families would be get preferential treatment when it comes to food. So that has been interesting.
Absolutely.
How they have personalized, in fact, many of the exercises we go through.
Absolutely. And it leads right into the next exercise, which, mm-hmm, again, we are always now at this point trying to integrate the gender, the power. Every exercise builds on the next exercise, and this one's really about looking at issues around nutrition, where we talk about, what is the ideal plate of food, what's the correct, and we put this in quotes, nutrition. And we usually have nutritionists in the audience, so that's really helpful. And then we talk about, okay, well, that's great. So then let's look at what is a typical plate in the culture and the communities, mm-hmm, that you work in. Mm-hmm. And again, it's like, wow, especially when we were in Bangladesh, we looked at a typical plate which was 95% rice.
Yes.
Which, is useful if you like rice, but it isn't very nutritious. And so, you can have that discussion around what is the correct and ideal plate for nutritional needs at different stages of people's lives, and, et cetera, et cetera. But then you can talk about what's reality. And then we talk about, so what's it going to take to move from what's reality to what's ideal, and what are the barriers and constraints to doing that? And then I think also we have that exercise then around the budget, the food budget.
Yes, that has been interesting. Where we, but before that, I wanted to mention something I tried in Tajikistan this last time with both workshops. When they actually did their plate, then I had them. This is in Russian or Tajik, I think. But yeah, I had this table where they looked at carbohydrates, protein, fats, and then vitamins, micronutrients, and had them look on their plates and where are the carbohydrates and why do we need them? And then where was the protein on their plate? And then where were the fats and vitamins and micronutrients? And then talked about if a family is with limited income, what is the best carbohydrate that you could have, the protein. But yeah, if you want to talk, Kathy, about then we have them actually, this was $5, $2, whatever their
currency is. Exactly. Well, because you think about, when we talk about extreme poverty in the world, mm-hmm, we're talking about people living on, less than $2 a day. And so I think it was you that initially created this exercise. We just said, okay, you've got $2. You got to feed a typical family in the communities that you work on $2. How are you going to do it?
And for one day, 3 meals.
Yep, exactly. Mm-hmm. And are you going to be able to provide a nutritious diet, mm-hmm, for those people in that household on $2 a day? And show me how you're going to do it. And, we really have to talk about that, because most people are just, number one, shocked because they're not living on $2 a day, the folks that we're training. But they're also really then, I think, appreciative of the people's needs to be able to grow their own food to supplement what they are eating and what they can afford to eat. And it kind of leads us into the next exercise, which was an exercise that I created a few years ago out of desperation, because I was doing a lot of work on agricultural value chains. And I'll just kind of move to this next slide. And we were looking at, issues around livestock, around raising crops, around raising, horticulture. And we were looking at issues around kind of doing a gender-based analysis after you basically listed all the steps of an agricultural value chain. You looked at who does what at each one of these different value chain nodes. And then you talked about, okay, who has access to those resources at each one of these nodes, and then who has control over those resources at each one of these nodes. And so we do a complete exercise around this, selecting value chains that are contextual for that particular country and community. But then on top of that, we added another aspect where we looked at nutrition around this, so that we've got the gendered aspects around the agricultural value chain, but then we looked at each node, where are people either not losing power but losing ability to have the proper nutrition. And again, looking at it from a gender perspective. So this exercise, I have done this in as short as half an hour to as long as half a day, depending on how involved people want to be. But we usually have a lot of people in the audience that are very keen to share their agricultural knowledge.
Yes, this. Definitely.
Yeah. This is a favorite exercise.
Yeah, because they're familiar with the actual production, the harvesting, the processing pieces, the transportation. But then when we add that component of the gender and nutrition piece, yes, it does generate.
Absolutely. No, this is a great exercise, and one that can be adapted to a variety of different locations. All right.
We'd like to share with you just briefly where the workshops have been held and how many people have attended. Since beginning last August in Bangladesh, we have facilitated 9 workshops in 5 countries: Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Kyrgyzstan, Nepal, and Tajikistan. And we've involved 227 participants. Wide range of ages. We've had people that have been in the field for 35, 40 years, and then students who were just starting their professional careers. Definitely varying levels of exposure and knowledge of gender and nutrition, so that has been really interesting to see. And then representing universities, ministries of ag, NGOs, lead farmers. It's been a very diverse group of people that we've been training.
Incredibly. And so we never know really, we do send out a pre-workshop assessment, and I put that in quotes, that looks at what people's experience is, what their level of knowledge is in these different areas. And then we do a post-workshop assessment immediately after the workshop to try and gauge the amount of knowledge and potentially even skills that were gained during the workshop. But we never really know who's going to attend these workshops I have sometimes gender scientists that know more than I do showing up at these workshops, to people that don't even know how to define gender or nutrition. Yeah. So it varies tremendously, but it's always fun.
Yes, and I think getting the people in the groups really helps too, because then they share their experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah. But we've learned a lot, Jan, during this period of time, and I have to say, from the experiences that I had previously with MIAs, same thing with the workshops that we conducted in different places in the world, that every one of the workshops was slightly different, that we would tweak it based on the context, but the materials that we developed are a superb framework for being adaptable and being very participatory, very interactive, very engaging from the very first exercise. And so, people are never bored, number one. And I think maybe throughout the whole 3 days we have, 2 PowerPoints?
Yeah, brief. Yes, very brief. Little, I call them mini lectures that we use.
Yeah, and I think that's been the overwhelming response from people, is that they love the content, and we always provide them with a jump drive at the end of the workshop that has numerous references, resource materials, the workshop materials, etc., and photos of the workshop. But the biggest positive response I think we both have received from almost every workshop participant is they love the process. They love the engagement. They love the participatory nature, and the fact that they get to play. They get to enjoy themselves while they're learning. And it energizes both of us, I think, as well.
Yes. Yes, I think another lesson is we've really emphasized from the beginning is the now what after each session, and here also at the end of how to apply and adapt because that's our main purpose, is that they're going to be implementing these activities and adapting them in the field, and not taking for granted that the participants will know how to apply and adapt, but really spending time to talk about what are they committed to doing in the field, and how would they do that? How might they change or adapt based on their particular environment?
Exactly, and that's included a little bit in our post-assessment or evaluation,
Yes.
quote, of the workshop, where we ask for what's your commitment, what are you going to do now that you've gained all this information and these materials, and how's it going to make a difference in your work, which is just great. And we've been really fortunate. We've been able to train a number of in-country facilitators that are continuing this work on, and we really kind of stay engaged with participants. We had the one group in Nepal that has set up their own Facebook page to stay connected with each other, and we're constantly receiving little notes from workshop participants saying, hey, this is how I've adapted the materials and this is how I'm using them. So we're very encouraged.
Yes, I think that really is helpful. This is a picture of Mahinahan and Elena, who were facilitators in training in Kyrgyzstan, and just how helpful that has been. And also our for me, one of the lessons learned is having the right people at the workshop, and by right I mean participants who can actually use the training, the different activities in the field with the clients. That they actually, that's their main job. That has been really helpful too.
Exactly.
In having, and I think too, just I was surprised how the individual groups respond to the different activities. Kathy, you mentioned
Absolutely.
that, and especially the role plays. And
that has been fun, but it's also been fascinating to watch when we come to different countries how willing people are to get outside their comfort zone, outside of their traditional roles. And it's been, I would say that in most of the countries, because by the time we get that exercise and it's later in the workshop, people are relaxed and they're feeling more comfortable with each other, et cetera, et cetera. But you mentioned that in Tajikistan it was a little bit more difficult to get the men to relax and actually dress up as women.
And then others just go all out. In Nepal they were taking the tablecloths off, and so it's just
it's been fun. But we do a follow-up after the workshops are over. It's not just all about fun and games. We're really interested in finding out, how are you going to use this information? What are you going to do with this to change not only your own behaviors, but the work that you do in the field with the partners, the communities that you work with? And please, respond back to us, because we send out kind of a 3-month follow-up to check in with people, and we ask people to share their stories on the INGENEAS Facebook page, to send us information if it can go up on the INGENEAS website, so that we can really share the learning that is going on through these different workshops.
Yes, try to document that implementation impact of the workshops we're doing. We wanted to share with you real briefly the extension unit in Bangladesh at the Agricultural University has developed, they have their own website dedicated, and they have some YouTube videos where they are showing how they have taken the one activity we're going to show you is who does what, and they have taken that out to the village and have used that with the men and women and children too, to do that particular activity. So that's very encouraging to know that the participants are actually going out in the field, and that's what we're following up. So we'll take a minute here to show the video.
The video, yeah.
So that was just a brief example of how things are being applied in the field. And we wanted to share with you, one of our participants at the Kyrgyzstan workshop has a blog, and he did a wonderful job of capturing how he felt about the training and what it meant to him. And one of his last pieces in that blog was this quote, that trainings that serve not only as ways of learning new skills and knowledge, but as food for thought. temples where trainees are inspired to action. And that is certainly our goal.
That is a beautiful quote, Jan.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, we're delighted to be able to share these materials on the INGENEAS website. Happy to answer any questions that people might have. I mean, obviously, in this particular venue, you need to ask them through Andrea, but just delighted to have had the opportunity to not only create these materials, but to share them with people around the world.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much.